Please welcome the panel on What Faith Means to Me, moderated by Richard Sandler, Executive Vice President of the Milken Family Foundation, partner at Maron and Sandler, and author of Witness to a Prosecution, The Myth of Michael Milken.
Welcome. Our panel today, as you just heard, is What Faith Means to Me. Over the next hour, we're going to have a chance to discuss faith, religion, spirituality in America. What role does it play today? What role should it play? How should it be affecting our lives and our society to address so many of the issues that we all care about, from isolation, loneliness, depression that affects so many, especially our young people, to the divisiveness that seems to be getting worse and worse every year. We'll talk about how we can listen to one another, respect one another, and focus on what's important in spite of the talking heads, the social media, and all of those that try to take advantage of this divisiveness. I feel really privileged here to work with such a distinguished panel as we have here today. I have over there Mike. Wave your hand, Mike. Michael Dimock is president of Pew Research Center. As many of you know, Pew is a leading source of nonpartisan, non-advocacy data that enriches our public dialogue and supports sound decision-making. In fact, Mike would say that they're not a leading source, that they are the leading source. Pew actually has been studying religion and faith for many decades and has reached some very interesting conclusions about the direction and what it means to people in America. On the left of Mike, Bishop T.D. Jakes. Bishop Jakes is the founder and senior pastor of Potter's House, a non-denominational megachurch in Dallas, Texas, which he founded in 1996. And recently announced his retirement from. Bishop Jakes has got one of the largest congregations in America, is an author and filmmaker among many, many other things, and has written a number of books, and a very spiritual, knowledgeable, and a very wise man of faith. Mm-hmm. And it's a privilege to have you here. Sitting next to Mike there is no stranger to the stage here at the Milken Conference or any Milken events. Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Collins recently retired as director of the National Institute of Health. He served in that position under 3 separate administrations. He recently published his second book, which he will hold up right now without... and he'll be discussing it at an author session this afternoon. As you can see, the book is The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. He'll share his wisdom and his deep faith and how it's affected his life. And last, and certainly not least, my good friend, Rabbi Sharon Brous. Sharon is the founding rabbi of IKAR here in Los Angeles, a leading-edge Jewish community, and she has recently written a book that she will be talking about tomorrow, The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World. Rabbi Brous, in addition to being a good friend, is considered one of the most influential rabbis in America today. Her works have been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, none of which I read, among others. And Rabbi Brous is a very spiritual, knowledgeable, and just an outstanding woman of faith, and we're glad to have her here. So let's get started. Mike, you at Pew, you've done a lot of studying in this area. Tell us what your research has shown, where we are today as a country, and what does faith actually mean to America versus religion or spirituality?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And that's a great setup. Religion, religiosity, spirituality, they tend to often get treated as synonyms, but I think they're not, right? In our own individual experience, in our experience as communities, they're very different concepts. sort of the way we would think of religion when we measure it is a religious identity, an identity with a faith tradition of some form, often has a name like Christianity or even denomination within that. And that's an area where in America the trend has been a trend of declining religious affiliation, identification in that way. But that decline has actually paused over the last 6 years or so. It was one of the most interesting findings of our last major study is that over the last 6 years, that decline that seemed inexorable and was driving a lot of conversation in America about a secularization has really kind of taken a bit of a pause. And to me, it's a really interesting question we may be able to get into, because when the pandemic hit 5 years ago, it raised really interesting questions about the role of religion in people's lives. Would the isolation of it continue to erode or even accelerate the erosion of that religious connection in our lives? Or would it lead to a kind of resurgence of the importance of religion and faith and spirituality, both at a community level and at a spiritual level in people's lives? And the fact that that trend has flattened even suggests, I think, more the latter than the former. When we talk about religion, we often talk about the role religiosity plays in people's lives, which is a combination of community and belief, right? Belief in the precepts of a religious faith. That's also declined. But spirituality, I think, is very different. Spirituality can mean a lot of things to us. Sometimes it's in terms of a faith tradition or a religion. So I wrote some numbers down just to be clear from our polling. Do you believe in God or a universal spirit? 83% of Americans would say that. That's far higher than the share who identify with a religious identity or even describe themselves as religious people, but they still have this faith, this belief. 86% of Americans say people have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body, right? This belief that we are more than what can physically be measured, right? Sometimes it's just more general views of the world. 79% of Americans say there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if we cannot see it, right? That may not be explicitly thinking in the definition of a faith tradition or religion as most people think of it. It's more of a sense of connection to something broader, something more powerful that's in your lives. There are many ways people think about spirituality, and when I read those numbers, those are very widespread feelings, associations people have at an individual level and sometimes at a community level. And that, there's not a lot of evidence, has declined in America. That spiritual nature is also a signature of America. It's a space when we do work in countries around the world compared to other, say, G20, high socioeconomic countries. America always stands out on these dimensions of being a more spiritual, a more religious country.
No. It's interesting. So, Sharon, you just finished your book, A Man of Fact. You talk in your book a lot about isolation, loneliness. You talk about the importance and potential of every human being, which I know you believe very, very strongly. And you talk about ways we can improve our lives. So just start with the name of this panel. What does faith mean to you? And how have you experienced at IKAR, your congregation, since COVID, as compared to what the data shows?
Okay. First of all, what a joy to be with all of you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. The first thing I'll say is that we actually launched our community in 2004, in part in response to what some of the Pew studies were showing, both from the 90s and from 2000, which was that there was this really steep decline in attachment to or connection to religious community. And there were many young Jews who identified as nuns, that didn't mean they didn't have spiritual yearning. It didn't mean they weren't hungry for community, for ritual, that they didn't want to talk about the soul. They wanted all of that, but they did not identify Judaism or organized religion in any way as part of the answer to the questions that they were asking. And so we wanted to build a faith community that really stood at the intersection of a kind of spiritual revitalization and also the quest for a more just and loving society. And about 10 years into our project, I started to realize that our country was, first of all, that these weren't just Jewish trends. These were religious trends across the board. And that our country, and maybe globally, we were experiencing what the Surgeon General went on to call a loneliness epidemic, that there was a great sense of disconnection in the broader culture social alienation, isolation, and loneliness, that people did not feel known or seen. And so we, in many ways, reshaped our mission, that we weren't only standing at the intersection of reanimating ancient traditions as a source of meaning and purpose in a very broken world, and as a kind of obligation to live as good citizens in that world, but we were also trying to build a collective that would be responsible to the needs of the Spirit, that there was a spiritual crisis around loneliness that also the doctors were starting to tell us was manifesting as a physical crisis, that loneliness hurts the body as much as it hurts the soul. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this in my book talk tomorrow, that Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century political philosopher, said is a precondition for the destruction of a society. That that a society cannot be vulnerable to totalitarianism or tyranny if people know and love their neighbors. And so we were seeing this growing, very dangerous trend, and we realized that the answer to all of this is community. And faith communities had a particularly important role to play. These trends were only exacerbated by COVID as people became even more isolated from one another. And we responded by trying to really redouble our efforts to build connection and build community. So why does faith matter, or what does faith mean to me? I think faith is both about the inner life. It's both about deepening connection to holiness or to the Holy One, depending on how you look at it, deepening connection to our own sense of meaning and purpose, to our own best selves, humility, empathy, gratitude, the things that are not easy to track in the data, but we know are the things that make our lives worth living. And it's also not only about the inner life, but about connecting the work that we do internally with the collective, with building a better society in which more people can be free, in which more people can live a just and dignified life, in which peace is possible. So faith fuels our most aspirational dreams, and then encourages us or mandates that we go out and start to work to manifest those dreams on the street in reality.
So Bishop Jakes, you've heard, what Sharon was just talking about. I know you and I have talked about some of those exact same issues. And when she talks about this could lead to the destruction of society, okay, what are some of your concerns about where we are going as a country, as a society, where that might lead? And what have you seen actually, in your church since COVID or even before?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to remember is that one voice can change a room can change a city can change a state can change a country can change a world. Empowering ourselves to understand that we have an obligation, that we can be that voice for good or for evil, gives us a toggle switch that we have to toggle correctly, and we can't toggle it correctly if we don't have a good self-image. When you speak about faith, I'd like to use the metaphor of a mustard seed. Planted underground, the first work is done on the person it's planted in. But it's not finished there until it springs forth and breaks the sod and begins to affect the elements around it. So when you start talking about the impact that we can have on the world, it starts first within us, and then out of the abundance of what happens in us begins to flow toward other people. Now, I realize we're living in a highly divided society, in part because we're told we are. I don't see us fighting in the elevator. I don't see us driving our golf carts over top of each other. I don't see us in the grocery store, running over each other. I'm not sure that in actuality it is severe as it is, but the technology that we have a tendency to bring out our worst angels through the technology, but face to face with each other, interacting with each other as we were designed to interact with each other, there seems to be at least some level of acceptance and camaraderie. And I think it's important that we understand that if we don't address more than faith and get down to understanding that the condition of man's lifestyle has a lot to do with his attitude. And all down through history, the fall of every great civilization was preceded by the absence of middle class. And because the brain has a propensity to have dissonance when it comes to reasoning, if you don't, we need somebody to blame. The brain buffers if it can't come to a conclusion. So we need somebody to blame for our dilemma, which becomes the epitome for racism, sexism, and all the other isms, because my plight has to be nailed to somebody else's behavior rather than to recognize that I have the power within myself to change my circumstances, uplift my life by a connection with God and living out my purpose in alignment with what I was designed to do. That I'm not a mistake, I'm not an accident. The circumstances around my birth may not be perfect, but I am here on an assignment and a mission, and the closer I get to that mission, the more fulfilled I'm going to be, and the better I'm going to be toward other people.
Mm-hmm. So, Francis, Dr. Collins, your books, Truth, Science, Faith, Trust. How do those terms relate to one another? But also pick up a little bit on what Bishop Jake said about we need to blame somebody. You were director of the National Institute of Health during COVID. Okay, I'm sure that resonates with you.
Oh, yeah.
So, anyway, please.
Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. I don't think in the many years I've been coming to the Milken Global Conference that we've often had a panel like this to talk about faith. And yet we just heard from Mike that that's something that's important to the majority of Americans. So I'm glad we're talking about it here. I'm a scientist. It might surprise you to hear, therefore, that I am a person of faith. In fact, a rather serious one. I'm a Christian, but I didn't grow up that way. Maybe after a bit, I'll say a little bit more about my own faith journey, but I became a Christian at age 27. And it has been the foundation of everything that I've tried to understand and think about and work on since then. And I've not found a circumstance where what I know as a scientist, which is to learn in the rigorous possible way how nature works, and what I know as a person of faith about the why questions are in conflict. I find them to be remarkably harmonious. But I don't know that the church has necessarily perceived that. So I'm glad we're talking here today about science and faith, because I think it was a Pew survey a few years ago that asked the young people who were leaving the church in large numbers. I'm glad that's sort of leveled off at the moment, but it was pretty bad for a couple of decades. And what are the reasons you're leaving? Number one was what they perceived as hypocrisy in the church, that the church was not practicing what they preached. Number two was what they perceived as a rejection of science by the church in circumstances that made them question whether they should trust anything else that the church was telling them about faith. And that was a strong reason. And I still get plenty of emails from young people who were raised in a church background that did not see science as trustworthy. And particularly this comes up with questions like origins of, how did the earth begin and when? And are humans related to other species through the process of evolution? The data is absolutely clear in that circumstance, but a lot of churches are still teaching a young earth creation perspective, which then puts those young people in a terrible crisis when they get to university and see the actual data. We shouldn't be doing that to young people. Fortunately, I think there's some progress that's been made. Another plug besides the book, which I appreciate your raising in the introduction and which I'll talk about at 4 o'clock today, is a foundation called BioLogos, BIOLOGOS, which I started 18 years ago as a means of trying to provide a civil discourse meeting place for people who are interested in faith in a serious way, but also interested in rigorous science and see an opportunity there to learn from each other. So biologos.org, with now millions of people who check in there on a regular basis, as well as conferences, as well as curriculum they put together for homeschooled Christian students, has, I think, made a difference. And I don't perceive that conflict about origins is quite as intense as it was maybe 20 years ago, perhaps in part because this kind of recognition of the potential harmony here is becoming more widespread. So you asked about COVID, and as a person of faith, I have to say the year 2020 was a time where a lot of prayer was part of my experience, because we were watching thousands of people die every day from this virus, and we were trying to learn as much as we could about it as fast as we could, and designing in record time the most rigorous trials for the mRNA vaccines that ultimately proved by the end of November 2020 to have remarkable efficacy, 90-95% in terms of preventing hospitalization and death, and a very satisfactory safety record as well. And that really did feel like both a triumph of science, but for me also an answer to prayer. Sometimes God works through us to achieve things that we're praying about. It certainly felt that way at the time. What was disheartening, though, was the course of the next year, it became clear that more than 50 million Americans were not interested in taking advantage of that vaccine. And Kaiser Family Foundation has done the analysis of the consequences and concluded that between June of 21, when vaccines were readily available to anybody who wanted one, and March of 22, just about a 9-month period, 234,000 Americans died unnecessarily. That's an astounding number. What group was most likely to be in that category? It was white evangelical Christians. I'm a white evangelical Christian. What happened to us? How did we end up having such a coming apart here of a circumstance where prayers had been answered, and yet the gift that was being given was not seen as a gift that people recognized as safe for them or effective? And sometimes there were even faith perspectives added to this, such as the suggestion that this might be the mark of the beast if you were to get the vaccine. That really shook me up, and that's part of the reason I try to write this book about where we are as a society. And again, I think faith is a pretty darn important part of that. But it's also about, is there such a thing as objective truth? I would say yes. You can't do science if you don't think there's truth to be discovered. And also, therefore, where are we as far as increasing distrust in science, which is happening, especially in faith communities, at least some of them. And then trust. How do we decide who to trust, which has gotten all fractured by the fact that we tend to be trusting people who are in our own bubble, even if they don't have credentials, but distrusting people in the other bubble, even if they have the expertise. And that's getting in our way as well. Again, I think people of faith have a critical role to play here. For my own faith, Christianity, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and see all of the exhortations about how we should be behaving ourselves now in the midst of this kind of crisis, and see how far short we seem to be. It's not blessed are the rich, remember? It's blessed are the poor and the meek. We have a ways to go to retrieve a lot of those foundations that have served us well in other crises, but are now looking a little frayed. That was a bit of a wandering through your question, and I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, you did. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So, Mike, what does the data show people's attitude is about faith versus science?
Yeah.
Okay, how does people think of these issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, you introduced it as you might be surprised that I'm a scientist of faith, and I think a lot of people say that. The precept is, they can't coexist, but most people we talk to in our surveys don't see that as an intrinsic conflict. One of my favorite questions from the survey this year, which do you agree with? There are some things that science cannot possibly explain, or there's a scientific explanation for everything, even what we don't understand. And most people are on the first, and that's not a rejection of science, right? 69% would say there are just some things that science can't explain. There's an act of faith beyond, right, the natural world. And again, that's not a conflict. That's not a rejection of what science can tell us. It's not a rejection that science can't achieve advances for us. it's just still a sense of wonder, a sense that there will always be another question out there. There will always be a why, to use your language, that I think people embrace in addition to seeking knowledge and seeking truth, seeking fact through science. And one interesting thing is we ask people, do you think science and religion are in conflict? And it's actually about 50-50 in America. About half would say, yeah, I think there's a conflict between religion and science, and the other half say there's not. More religious Americans are less likely to see that conflict on average, right? So 70% of more religious Americans say, I don't see the conflict, right? I can believe both. It's actually the less religious Americans who perceive this sense that there's an intrinsic conflict. And I think it comes from a little bit of what you were touching on, that there's a sense of a social divide in what you were talking about, that we are at odds in some way, whether it's class, whether it's our social beliefs, but that there's a sense of division there that's at a societal level that isn't really about the beliefs themselves. And that's a tension around religion right now in America.
Well,
Can I jump in?
Sharon, yeah, please, go ahead.
You know, we're living in an era where opinion has cannibalized truth.
Yes.
And no matter how many books we write or panels we sit on, we don't have the influence over the ears of the majority of Americans who are getting their information from TikTok. Mm-hmm. And I think it is incumbent upon us that we go where they are, mm-hmm. and break our content down into snackable content and put it in such a way, because they actually are following the advice of people who are not only not credentialed, not qualified, not capable, but that voice is being believed and trusted because it comes in a form that looks familiar to the person who's watching it. And I think the smartest thing that we can do to influence that one voice that I said that can change the room, that one voice has to go beyond libraries where we educate the educated and influence the people who are already influenced and break it down. I'm not saying we should stop writing books. I wrote a lot of them. But break it down into nuggets, what is called snackable content, that enables people of all ages to have the experience we have here today. We're having a great experience, in my view, here today of very powerful thought leaders. But how do we get that thought into the mainstream of America and not just the intellectuals in America?
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Bishop. And I guess the other part of that is, how do we make sure that those messages are in fact consistent with the real fundamentals of faith? Mm-hmm. I'm worried that at the present time, it seems that messages about wealth and prosperity are better received than calls to serve those who are sick or in jail or suffering in various ways. Matthew 25 comes to mind. We're not putting that message out very effectively, it seems. And yet I think those of us who've seen what's happened over the course of history, those are often the times where faith is the most noble, most appealing to people, oddly enough. I don't know that everybody's really looking for more wealth and prosperity. They want to have meaning. They want to have a purpose.
Right.
And faith can give you that, but the versions of it that are sometimes put forward, especially in a snackable way, seem to be more about, hey, there's something in this for you, as opposed to there's something in you for everybody else.
Well, Sharon, you were talking about how you started IKAR with the idea of community and giving back and looking at something greater than oneself.
Yeah.
So as you hear this discussion about people's attitudes versus science and who it is, what have you seen? You've built a congregation from, I believe, 20 to 30 people on folding chairs in a living room to probably around 1,100 families today.
5 people in a living room to 1,300 families. So, So, I mean, I'm not opposed to devising social media strategies that can help us create snackable content, but I increasingly feel pulled away from the whole game of the algorithm and trying to fight against the callousness and cruelty like this. It feels like a sinkhole, And instead, I am really invested in building in-person encounters where people can actually sit together like Richard and I do over lunch and talk about all the things we disagree on, which are, I think, only 2% of all of our ideas, but they take up most of our time. But I think I really feel a deep pull to humanity. And I don't know that there are many people whose ideas have changed because of something they've seen on TikTok. I think what changes us is when we cultivate a kind of curiosity toward another person, and we have enough of a relational connection that we're willing to invest in asking them, what do you see from your vantage point? Something you said or did caused me pain. Can you tell me what you were thinking when you did that or posted that or wrote that? And so I'm increasingly drawn to the kind of true personal connections rather than thinking about the broader landscape. Not that it's not important work, and I think it should be done. I think a lot about Dr. King's vision of the beloved community and this great dream of what it would mean to live in a world without racism and exploitation and poverty and human cruelty and callousness, and how you can't build that dream until we learn how to love each other, until we actually treat each other with a kind of basic decency. And that is an incredibly counternormative message for our time. And it does feel right now that the dominant voices are pulling us very dramatically, that both the profit models and the people who are platformed, who have the biggest platforms in the country and in the world, are pulling us toward a very different kind of engagement with each other. And so I feel all the more so, like there's this thing that they say about the Jews, we're just like everybody else, but more so, you know? And I think we have to be just like who we are at our core, but even more so. When the tide outside pulls us toward isolation, pulls us toward callousness and cruelty, we have to be even more invested in love, even more invested in relationships, in compassion, in a sense of wonder, cultivating a sense of awe and wonder. And so I feel myself being pulled toward a kind of counter testimony, which is actually something that my faith community gave me as a gift, because I think one of the gifts of faith is that it attaches you to something much older than you. And for me as a Jew, I was in church, actually, on Christmas Eve, visiting the church of my friend, Reverend Ed Bacon in Pasadena, if anyone hears from All Saints in Pasadena, when I had just moved out to LA as a young rabbi, and I heard him tell the story of Christmas from his perspective. And I was brought to tears, and I realized, my God, that's such a beautiful story. And I have my own story, and it's a different story, but it leads us to be great partners with each other in the work of bringing more dignity and more love to the world. And that was the first time I realized that the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which is the obsessive center of the Jews' collective memory, is actually the core narrative of our people. And it calls us to build a counter testimony to the world that we live in. It says, you lived in humiliation and degradation and enslavement in Egypt. What does freedom mean? It means building a society that counters those norms by creating new norms. So radical social responsibility, a true sense of belonging, a true sense of love and care, always the dream of peace, never giving up on the dream of peace. And so I feel my faith tradition not only is about the inner work and my relationship with God, but also about carrying that story forward and into this time and saying, wow, we are living in a raging storm right now. So what is the counter narrative to that storm? What tools do I have? What messages do I have that I can anchor in right now that can help us build something that might be, or that is, an opportunity for us to hold on to something that's truly eternal and will benefit everybody?
I absolutely and totally agree with everything you said. And I think that the ultimate communication is face-to-face. The reality is there is a generational component to this discussion that we have to think about, because we have generations who were raised with technology and not with people, and they are not as fluent talking to people as they are with texting and doing other things. And I have 5 children, they're grown now, but they sit around the table and text each other, okay? And try all I want to break through with this human connection and what I grew up with and my values the two things can be true at the same time. Everything you said is absolutely true. But the other truth is I 10x my congregation on stream. Mm-hmm. I have 10 times more people streaming me than I do in the building. In my day, that was unheard of. Right. Some of them get dressed up and sit in the living room and go to church on a stream. Come on, hear the clap. This is happening. We might not like it. We might not want it. It is not as authentic as the fellowship that I grew up off of and that endears me. But it is a reality that we have raised a generation of people who haven't yet learned, and I think they will later in life, the beauty of human connection, the necessity of human connection, the comfort of human connection, the love of human connection. I think that isolation and that I want to be safe and I want to control the environment and I want to watch it when I want to watch it and I'm not going to get up at 11 o'clock. I will do the replay at 3. This convenience thing has eaten up the comfort that you so eloquently spoke about. And I say, instead of picking which one is right, let's get them all. Let's get them all. Let's not stand at the top of the hill and go down there and bite one lion, one sheep. Let's go out and get the whole herd. And if we're going to get the whole herd, irrespective of age and preferences, I think we have to have a multi-pronged approach that embraces people, because when they started streaming, I was irritated. I won't lie, I was irritated. I want you to come. How am I going to serve communion on TV? How am I going to baptize on TV? There were so many problems with that that it drove me crazy. But no matter how crazy I got about it, they kept doing it. And 10x people got reached, and people got reached in other countries. People got reached in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. People got reached around the world, in the Middle East, that I would have never gotten in the 4 walls of my church, and I had to have a multi-pronged approach. We translate our message into 90 different languages because we opened up the portal to more than just human touch, while still embracing our connection and loving each other and holding each other and doing all those beautiful things, hoping to make them jealous enough to want to come.
Yes. By the way, we're both right. We've had the same experience with our community, and we have people from all over the world who are coming to our Shabbat morning services now from their homes.
Right.
And so I want the whole world to hear Bishop T.D. Jakes. So I'm with you. And I also think there's nothing in the world that takes the place of building real relationships and spaces where people can actually connect with other human beings. I think that's absolutely essential to our humanity.
Yeah. It's interesting because, well, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's also a caricature of younger folks as if the online life or that I love that point about at my convenience is an alternative to human connection. I think most young people we talk to, and we talk to them about technology, whether they're teenagers or young adults, they see it as augmenting. They want both, right? They get a lot of value out of the digital communities they have, but that doesn't mean they don't strive for that in-person community as well. There's a recognition and a yearning for that. And I agree with what you're saying. The scaffolding for that feels weaker, right? And that's something that we can provide, that you can provide. Sort of how do younger people, find that connection? We see it in what people tell us they want, right? And we see it even in this division between somebody referenced before, that younger people are more skeptical sometimes of the institutions, right? There's a lot of that language of institution that feels like, I don't want to be labeled, I don't want to have to sign on to something that's now an identity, but they still want the community of it, and they want, in many ways, the spirituality of it, the faith of it that we're talking about here today. So speaking across the board on that, digitally and in person, I think speaks to that generation.
At the risk of talking too much, I think what I have found amongst young people, I've ministered in prisons, I've ministered in the White House. What I have found about people is they are losing emotional language. Emojis, tweets, all of that kind of stuff is robbing the ability to say, I feel pain. That hurt me. I am grieving. They're having those feelings, but they're trapped behind the lack of use of language. The artistry, the absolute artistry of language is one of the few gifts that is isolated to humanity, and the ability to read a book or to express ourselves. That's what's eroding, and I think that at the core of it, we have to make connection sexy again. Okay, pardon me, Sam.
No, please.
But you understand?
Yes.
We have to model it in such a way that they start seeing the value of overcoming the vulnerability of expressing, finding a word, because I don't have to find a word on my phone. I can give you a heart.
No.
I mean,
Look, there's you're making me think about comments in both of your books, okay, that comes out, which I hope is a message that people here can take away here today. So, Sharon, in your book, you make a comment about a lesson of don't be a victim, don't be a hero, be a learner. Francis, in your book, you said we should be listening versus arguing, being a student rather than a teacher, okay? Which is, I think, why we're here today. But, when you're thinking about this conversation, your comment, it's love to hear, this whole idea of why don't we listen more? And what can we gain by doing that?
Well, I think we've gotten way out of practice. And I agree with what Bishop Jake said earlier, that we're not as divided as the media would make you think, but we are certainly in a place where we tend to avoid people that we think don't agree with us on a certain topic instead of just sitting down and having a conversation about it. Maybe that topic is immigration, or maybe it's public health, or maybe it's gun control. We just sort of have, that's going to be an unpleasant conversation. And yeah, maybe Thanksgiving dinner is not going to be that much fun this year because there's going to be some tensions there that we used to have a better way of dealing with. But I think Bishop is right, though. A lot of our language has gotten lost there as well. The idea that you would sit down with somebody and say, I know you have a different view than I do about immigration. And I don't understand completely why we are in that different space. I want you to explain to me your position. And I'm going to listen so carefully that I'm going to tell you, after you tell me your perspective, this is what I heard. And you can tell me whether I heard you right. Does that sound like marriage counseling? Well, yeah. Do you think our country needs a little marriage counseling right now? It kind of feels that way. So instead of, which is unfortunately kind of our response right now, and again, I think it's conditioned by the lawlessness and incivility of social media, is as soon as somebody is starting to frame a perspective we don't agree with, we're not listening anymore. We're planning our snappy response to just tell that person why they're wrong. And what happens? They get even more dug in, because that's the reaction you get when somebody's challenging your perspective in an unfriendly way. This book, The Road to Wisdom, tries to take apart some of those dynamics, but doesn't try to be totally depressed about it either. And I love really what this conversation's a bit about, and particularly what Sharon was saying about how we might begin to find our way out of this mess. And one of those things really would be for each of us to decide we're going to be part of the solution. It is not coming from the politicians, and it's not coming from the media. If we're going to find our way out of this polarized situation, it's because we, the people, decide this is our mission. We're not happy with the way things are. And that means each person deciding, I'm going to reach out to somebody who I know doesn't quite agree with me, and I'm going to practice this experience of listening well enough to tell them what they said. And who knows, I might make a friend. I'm part of a group called Braver Angels that has kind of turned this into a very specific kind of formula that really works well, where you have people come together across very divided opinions, and by the end of an hour and a half, everybody is saying, I didn't realize we're not that far apart after all. We all really are seeking that, but we've lost our skills in doing so. So that would be one thing to do. The other thing I think we have to do, we haven't specifically talked about quite so much, is to figure out how to better filter what's coming at us in terms of the information, much of which is frankly not true, and which, unfortunately, we often don't make the distinction, especially if it comes from somebody who we think is of the same mindset as we are. So we've lost our anchor to objective truth. I actually heard on a panel yesterday a fairly distinguished person who manages things in AI saying, well, we all know there's no such thing as objective truth. I don't agree with that. I'm a scientist who believes that there's truth to be discovered about the universe. Otherwise, I couldn't go to the lab. And there is objective truth. The Earth really does go around the sun. It's not the other way around. And it's not okay to say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. Facts don't care how you feel. And as soon as you take a fact and decide you can dismiss it because you don't like its implications for you, then you're going down a rather slippery slope. And I think a lot of folks are caught in that circumstance. So if we could each of us begin to kind of refigure out how do you do that filtering of information, and maybe even check out our own inventory of things that we've decided are true to make sure they really are, then we'd have a better chance. But I think the most important one, though, coming back to you, Sharon, is that we're learning how to listen to each other. I mean, really listen to understand, not to try to make a point and tell this other person that they're wrong.
Which doesn't undermine your second point.
No.
I mean, listening, holding great curiosity about another person and their perspective doesn't mean that there's no objective truth. Right. We can both hold, really strong views and know that we're right, and also be curious about someone else by engaging their humanity. I think that's really important. I think one of the reasons that we don't get curious about each other is because we're afraid to lose our own narrative. We're afraid that we'll lose some kind of moral standing if we hear someone else's narrative. If we hear about their suffering, then we'll diminish our own suffering on some level. And we're in this kind of competitive landscape that's ultimately causing suffering to everybody. And so I think this is a really critical exercise. And here's what's at stake if we don't. I'm just going to go back to Hannah Arendt for a moment. Remember, she said that a society in which people don't know their neighbors is pre-totalitarian. That when people don't know and trust each other, and before COVID, 1 in 3 Americans did not know the names of their next door neighbors before COVID, and then it only got worse. So what happens in that society where we don't know each other and we don't take the time to connect with each other? Conspiracy theories thrive because we don't have any reason not to believe them. And someone's saying to us, this is why you're hurting so much, because this other group of people is responsible for your pain. And since I don't know the other group of people because I don't talk to the neighbors on that side of the street, or we never encounter each other in physical space and talk to each other, and we only fight online, we start to believe the worst of each other. And it's only a small step from really entrenched conspiracy theories to political violence. And so, it rains on your wedding day, and you're really upset, and someone tells you the Jews control the weather, you're going to hate the Jews until you actually talk to a Jew and realize it rains on all of our wedding days, it rained on mine. And then you think but that's just not true. That doesn't make any sense. And so I think part of the way that we break down this misinformation and disinformation is actually by knowing each other and engaging each other. I think that's the only way.
Well, it almost comes back to what you talked about at the beginning here about we have to find somebody to blame. Right. Okay? If you don't agree with me, then there's something wrong with you because you're responsible. Right. You and I had a conversation, I think, where you told me that back in the 13th century, there wasn't racism. There were problems with people fighting about religion.
Right.
And then you took it to closer to home when you said in 9/11, those people that flew those airplanes, they don't really care what anybody in that building thought about anything, right?
That's right.
So what do we learn there?
Our enemies should teach us our unity, because when they come to kill us, they kill us all. Without discrimination to age or orientation or gender or anything else, they kill us all. And as horrific as those illustrations are, there's something to be learned from them, that they're taking out an entire species. And we have the luxury in times of peace of dividing into tribalism. But in the time of war, in a foxhole, falling out of a tower, we're just people. And I think until we get to the point, the lofty, unlikely idea that we recognize, like all other beasts, we are a species, and stop dividing ourselves and neutralizing our combined strength in a way that really embraces all the gifts that we bring to the table, our enemies are wiser in their destruction of us than we are in our living together with us. And that concerns me, that I told you on the phone, that we can be friends and look different and be at different stages and stay in different neighborhoods, and we can actually like each other if we try, because you want your kids to do well, I want my kids to do well, you want your grandbaby to sit in your lap, I want my grandbaby to sit. There's more to unite us than there is to divide us, and those are the kinds of messages that we really need to talk. We're not that different. In a minute, we're going to go eat dinner. All of us. We might not eat the same thing. We might not go to the same place. And we are more integrated in our music, in our food, in our art, than we are in our company. You don't have to be Mexican to eat Mexican food. You don't have to be Caribbean to eat Caribbean food. And we are much more homogeneous in the way that we ingest food and music. I'm driving down the street and the guy's playing hip hop, and he's white as a sheet. And I mean, he's got it turned up on 12. And I'm sitting up here listening to classical music. Okay, so losing our stereotypes and giving people the freedom to explore each other, that's one thing TV gave us, the ability to look at each other from a safe place, and we adopted little pieces of each other. We need to do that again in connecting with each other in a holistic way without feeling like we're betraying our tribe to have a friend that's different from us. Our loyalty to our denominations, our tribes, and our creeds means that the destination overpowers the journey. The learning that he talked about, which I loved, only comes when you enjoy the journey and not the destination, which brought me back to the brain and its propensity to need to come to a conclusion, even if the conclusion is wrong, to stop the buffering that goes on in the cranium.
No. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to leave on a little bit of a high note, okay? So I'm just going to ask each one of you, and in 1 or 2 minutes, tell us what you would like the people here to leave with today. Okay, what should they be thinking about when they leave here today? How can they become better people? And we'll just go straight down. Sharon, we'll start with you.
Can we start on the other side?
Okay. All right. We're going to give Sharon she
Thanks.
made a request here. You know what, Francis? I'm going to start with you. You're not shy.
Well, it's been a great conversation. I guess I'm going to take this to a level of personal importance in terms of what are the really significant issues that we all have to decide while we have this eye blink of time on this planet. We get to decide what's going to be our work life, what's going to be our love life, and what are we going to do about God. I didn't deal with that question until I was 27, when as a medical student, sitting at the bedside of an elderly woman with really advanced heart disease, she shared her faith with me. I was uncomfortable as an atheist. And then she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "What do you believe, doctor?" I realized I didn't have an answer. If any of you don't have an answer today, this would be something to think about working on. It took me 2 years after being quizzed that way to dig through the rational basis for belief. I thought there wasn't one, and ultimately came to the conclusion that atheism is the least defensible position from a purely rational basis. It's the assertion of a universal negative, which scientists aren't really supposed to do. And I worked my way through atheism to agnosticism, to deism, and ultimately to theism, and an acceptance, not just of the idea of Christianity, but to the literal death and resurrection of Jesus as a means of giving me avenue to a holy God when I knew I'm not that holy. So if you've had an interesting conversation here today and you feel that God-shaped vacuum in your heart is maybe not quite as full as it might need to be, I hope you'll carry something away from this conversation that will encourage deeper reflection on that. I'm glad I did. It has changed my life permanently and for the better.
Mike?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things strike me. One is that this broader, think about that separation between religious identity and spirituality, and think about the places that we as individuals, however you experience the world, find that, because it can be different for different people, and there isn't necessarily, I think, a right or a wrong. And a second theme that I really want people to reflect on is this sense of community, because it's come up throughout this, that online communities and a conversation that's at a national or a global level is different than community where you're having human interaction with people who share a physical space with you but probably don't share a lot of other things with you, and that leads to different kinds of conversations and different kinds of connections. And that part of the challenge we're in is most of our community is happening at this distant national kind of online digital level, which is very different than the community that really is the foundation of democracy, that's the foundation of a society, which is at that more human level. And that's both about faith community at a local level, but it's also about the way we interact with people at a local level. And there's a lot going on in that, whether it's around media, whether it's around religion, but the localization of us as people is a big theme in this to me.
I believe that God is eternal, and I believe we're created in his likeness and in his image. I took care of my mother till she died. She had Alzheimer's, and as her mind began to deteriorate, she would have moments of lucidness. And she said to me, the only thing that got hold on me was my body. And suddenly, I never forgot that. The profundity of the statement that the part of us that really matters is not what we make up, what we dress in, what we look like, whether we have wrinkles or facelifts. We spend so much effort building up the part of us that doesn't last, and so little effort feeding the spirit of who we are. And if you can get peace in your spirit and in your heart, it affects every other area of your life. About 3 months ago, I had a heart attack, a massive heart attack. And I realized in that moment, with my church praying, because I had it on stage, with my church praying and the ambulance rushing me to the doctor to receive surgery through technology, that science and faith can work together. And I began to also understand that life is but a fleeting vapor, a very fleeting vapor. I had no warning or anything. It just happened just like that, just like you fall asleep watching TV. And we have to do a better job of getting in touch with our essence. And whether we're on the elevator or walking up to a stranger that looks different from us, take the risk of exposing who you are. I don't want to meet your representative. Expose who you really are. I know it's risky, because that is the part that God says, where art thou? Not the car, not the billions, not the doctorates. When he's searching through all the clutter of things we have gathered and been taught to find you in your essence. And if you find yourself in your essence, you will find the place where faith dwells.
Okay.
In your heart.
No. Beautiful. Okay, you wanted to go last.
Yeah.
You follow that one.
I did ask for that. I learned my lesson. Thank you for all of these. And I'm so struck by how several of you mentioned, this kind of the preciousness of life and the fragility of life. And And that's something I'm also thinking so much about. And what comes to mind is there's this Hasidic tradition that whenever you leave your house, you have a slip of paper in each pocket. And one says, I am but dust and ashes. Like, it's not all about me. There's a whole universe beyond me, and my needs are not the only needs that matter. And the other side is, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for my sake, the whole world was created. I fundamentally matter. I can't do everything, but I can do something. Right. And I think we're really living in a very dangerous moment that is not only a moment of political and social crisis, but really of spiritual crisis. Right. And that threatens to leave us feeling really powerless. And I'm one of my life-death moment from the last 2 weeks is at the death of a dear friend who was also one of the founders of our community. We talked about how in the last chapter of her life, when she was navigating stage 4 breast cancer and realized she was at the end, there was this quote that she kept circling back to, which is often credited to Viktor Frankl, even though it probably didn't come from Viktor Frankl. But the quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And in that choice lies our growth and our freedom. And I think there's so much stimulus right now. There's so much that's happening so quickly. Our devices are reminding us of all of them the minute they happen. And we feel like we don't have the agency to respond. And she, in her dying days, said, but there is a space. And you don't have to, nobody's forcing us to respond a certain way. We can respond to this moment with love. We can respond to this moment of eternal war with a dream of peace. We can respond to this moment of division by building relationships, with this moment of certainty with curiosity. And that's the choice that I hope that we will make.
So as we leave, I actually get the last word. And as Bishop Jakes was talking about the essence of us, it reminded me of a story of one of my teachers, one of your teachers, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, blessed memory, he used to love to tell the story at the time of creation of man. The Lord said to the angels, called them together and said, I want you to go onto earth because I'm going to create man. I want my essence to be on earth. I want man to know my essence. And the angel said, you can't do that because this man you're creating has this negative side and they will abuse it and they will take advantage of it and you can't do that. And he goes, I'm insisting on doing it, but I'll let you decide where to put it. So one of the angels says, let's put it up at the top of the highest mountain. Man could never get to the top of the highest mountain. He goes, man will figure it out. They'll figure out a way. They'll get oxygen. They'll figure it out. Well, what if we put it at the deepest part of the ocean? They can't breathe in the water. He goes, they'll figure it out. They'll get to the deepest part of the ocean. And one of the angels finally said, I got an idea. Let's put the essence of God into each and every human being. They'll never look for it. So as you leave here today, look for it. Go in there and find it. Learn to listen to each other. Let's learn from one another. We can learn more from people we think we disagree with by focusing on the things we actually agree about. Rabbi Schulweis used to also talk about and, not either or. Okay? So we have so much to do, but we have so much to offer. We owe it to our children. We owe it to our grandchildren. I've had the privilege of moderating panels for almost 20 years here at this conference. I don't think I've ever been on a panel that I thought was more important than this one. So thank you for being here. I hope you leave here and do your part to make this world better. Thank you very much.